Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Jacob Helberg, a national security expert and a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review, a U.S. congressional entity. He was last on our program for his book, The Wires of War. We're glad to have him back to talk about U.S. concerns of TikTok, Chinese technology companies, and investments. Welcome, Jacob.
Thanks for having me, Wenqi. It's great to be here.
All right, it's fine. They'll do it. Okay. So the fight to change TikTok's ownership from Beijing headquartered ByteDance to American ownership started in the Trump administration. And why is TikTok such a big concern to the United States national security? Isn't it just a social media app for fun? Just for your information, TikTok is also very popular among Taiwanese young people.
Yeah, so there are three big concerns that policymakers often debate in the US. The first, and perhaps the most minor, is a trade reciprocity concern. China doesn't allow any American content platform in China. It banned most American content platforms in the early 2010s, right after the Arab Spring, actually right around when you worked at the State Department. Google, Facebook, Netflix, GitHub, none of them are allowed in China. So trade reciprocity is an issue that has a lot of political resonance in the US. The second, which has really been brought out in full technicolor in the last year or so, are the propaganda concerns. The fact that there are concerns that the Chinese Communist Party could use its control over TikTok in order to push state propaganda and the CCP's political agenda in the US on 170 million devices. Those concerns hit close to home for a lot of people. After the horrible Hamas attacks against Israel, we saw the tidal wave of anti-Israeli propaganda. There's now a lot of academic literature that's coming out that's showing that a lot of the content on TikTok is skewed in a manner that seems to point to an agenda to try to divide the US and its allies. So there's a clear pattern. If you try searching for keywords like Uyghurs or Himalayas, you're going to get almost no content compared to the content that appears organically on other platforms like Instagram. And on the other hand, obviously, Al-Qaeda's letter to America went viral in a way that was incredibly odd and strange to a lot of people. So propaganda is number two. And third, the data security and surveillance, which has been one of the longstanding perennial concerns with the app. The fact that the Chinese Communist Party is able to instrumentalize its control over the app in order to surveil access the microphones on the cell phones, monitor a user's activities on other applications, and harvest American user data for China's political objectives. There's now a growing body of evidence that shows a troubling pattern. We know that user data of TikTok stars has been stored in China. We know that ByteDance used TikTok to track and spy on journalists from the Financial Times and Forbes. We know that former executives who left the company claim that the CCP has a master backdoor into everything on the app. And just last week, senators who received the Justice Department's classified briefing on TikTok called the data security concerns shocking. So you're seeing all of these concerns culminate into a broad effort to legislate, which I think is ultimately the right thing to do for national security. And I'm very proud that the commission that I serve on recommended legislative restrictions on Chinese social media companies.
Well, it's clearly a very complicated case. It's more than just this company, right? Because you've touched on, reciprocity issue. You've touched on foreign influence through media. And of course, the last part is data security. And each one of them is a big issue in and of itself. And it's not only about Chinese ownership, but, even the US social media has lots of issues around foreign interference, etc. What's interesting was, as I mentioned, right, Trump started, this concern about TikTok, but then when recently the bill in the House was being reviewed, he then said he doesn't really support the House version of this bill. And his former Treasury Secretary Mnuchin also offered to buy. So we're also not sure yet if the Senate will actually approve TikTok's ownership sale bill. And even if it does pass, right, the Chinese government has signaled that it would oppose the sale. So where is this all headed? Just about the single company? And is it really about TikTok, or is there a larger policy agenda that you and others and many others in the US are trying to address?
Well, you're right. I'm so happy you brought up the fact that President Trump was actually very ahead of the curve when it comes to the TikTok issue. And I think it's important to be honest about that. He was one of the first ones to call out the national security risks of TikTok back in 2020, before anyone was actually paying attention. I think one of the interesting facts that really got lost in the media is that Trump's comments on TikTok on Truth Social did not actually oppose the House bill. They expressed concerns about Meta. And days later, in an interview, President Trump did express concerns about China's ability to control the application of TikTok, and express some degree of support for removing China's control of TikTok. The reason that you're seeing so much focus in the US on TikTok specifically is because TikTok is on 170 million American devices. No other Chinese company comes close, so it poses unique risks. But at the end of the day, the bill that passed the House is largely focused on any social media application that's controlled by a foreign adversary, namely from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and has over 1 million monthly active users. So there is a broader policy at play. Historically, the US government has long had restrictions on the foreign ownership of traditional media in TV and radio. Social media companies have benefited from a loophole and weren't subject to these restrictions. And ultimately, the House version that passed closes that loophole and brings US policy closer in line with where it has been historically.
This is again really interesting, right? Because this touches on beyond China, just is social media, right? Should social media companies be regulated as a telecom, the traditional sort of telecom companies? That's one big issue. But you also have been, you mentioned sort of foreign ownership, right? So you've been cautionary about just in general Chinese owned technology companies. Obviously, TikTok is a big one. And there's Temu, there's Shein. Can you just explain why are you so concerned about, in general, technology companies that are popular in the United States?
Absolutely. And it's such an important issue for us to reckon with from a national security standpoint. The Chinese Communist Party has completely erased the dividing line between the public and the private sector. That is the fundamental issue. They have made the decision to pass a number of successive laws, from the national intelligence law to the counter-espionage law last year, that completely erased the traditional division between the public and the private. There is no such thing as a private company in China anymore. Every company in China can be enlisted to advance the CCP's political agenda.
Can
And
you
that
just can you on that point, do you mind just elaborating on that? Because I don't think that's a concept that's that non-Chinese are used to it. Like, what does that mean? No private companies are private.
It means that every company in China effectively has a dual mandate. On the one hand, it has the mandate to serve its traditional purpose of a company the way that we understand in the US, maximizing value to shareholders, producing products that people want on the private market. But on the other hand, it has another mandate, which is to help advance the political objectives and agenda of the Chinese Communist Party inside China or potentially abroad. And that is very unique. You don't have that in most other countries. In the US, the US government can't simply ask a private company to advance its agenda and require that by law. Same thing in Europe. There is a division between the private and the public, and that dual mandate poses unique risks when we're talking about technology companies, which most of which are inherently dual use in nature.
So, in that case, right, do you wish to see the US basically without any presence of Chinese technology companies? And how would you define Chinese? I mean, we're getting into sort of, a lot of the concerns from the Asian American communities in particular, right? So, for example, when you say Chinese, do you mean by like location of the headquarters or nationality of the founders or by financial ownership? And if it's by financial ownership, TikTok is actually owned by quite a few large investment firms in the US, like BlackRock, General Atlantic, etc. So how do we really think about this sort of Chinese technology companies?
Yeah, you have to look at the Chinese Communist Party's ability to exercise jurisdictional and political control over that entity. And so location of the headquarters is one aspect, but legal ownership and control is another. If you remove the legal and the financial ownership piece, you actually solve a lot of the issues, provided obviously the location piece is addressed as well. But those three criteria are, in my view, the most important ones.
I mean, it probably won't be easy to really clearly define what Chinese influence or Communist Party influence is over those companies. And so, some people have raised concerns, and, the Yale University economist and former Morgan Stanley Asia chair, Stephen Roach, called the House bill of TikTok, basically, he said it's xenophobic. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with most things that Stephen Roach says, and his record of being wrong on most China-related questions speaks for itself. With that being said, I actually think the House bill is Sinophile. Look, the first victim of the Chinese Communist Party is a political party. It is not, it is not the same thing as Chinese civilization and the nation of China, although the CCP would like to conflate the two. Being critical of the Chinese Communist Party is not the same thing as being critical of the Chinese people. In fact, the Chinese people are arguably have been the first victims of the brutality and the authoritarian practices of the Chinese Communist Party. The critique that most policymakers in the US have about China are really focused on the Chinese Communist Party, its political agenda, the fact that its brutality towards its own people, whether it's in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, and the fact that it has an international agenda that is fundamentally at odds with the US. Ultimately, being critical of that agenda is not xenophobic. It's actually the right thing to do from a human rights standpoint, both around the world, as well as from a human rights standpoint for the Chinese people. So I don't think it's xenophobic at all.
And probably just from rule of law, and also, what is a better way of doing business and fair competition and all these aspects. And on that, you also have been behind the initiative to sort of stop more US investment from flowing to China. Do you think that's possible? And can you just elaborate on sort of what you're hoping to accomplish with that?
I think it's possible. I think you're seeing more and more companies and firms look at China as an uninvestable asset because, on the one hand, they're seeing increasing scrutiny in Washington on cross-border transactions between the US and China as tensions are rising. But on the other hand, they're also seeing the political environment and the business environment in China becoming a lot less friendly to foreign investment. And so it's no surprise that new foreign investment into China this year has actually dropped to a 3-year low. Obviously, economic growth is facing significant headwinds, all of which is not being helped by the fact that the political climate in China is very, very hostile if you're a foreign company. If you're a foreign company, your employees could get criminalized if they do basic due diligence, if they engage in basic due diligence practices that is considered completely normal and legal in most other countries. They could be treated as spies. So all of these types of new rules make it very hard to do business in China.
And I have to ask, because, right now, for example, there's this news story that a number of American CEOs are currently in Beijing and will be meeting Xi Jinping on Wednesday. Clearly, there's still a lot of companies, American companies and CEOs who want to reassure Beijing that their investment and commitment to China continues. And how do you explain this phenomenon, given just, China is increasingly viewed as a risky market to do business? Why do they continue to do that?
Well, a lot of them have pre-existing, there's an important distinction to be made between new investment and legacy and, making investments to support legacy operations. A lot of companies have a lot of legacy operations in the form of factories, in the form of CapEx and joint venture partnerships that are already there. And so in a world where a lot of companies are looking at de-risking and moving some of their operations to Vietnam and India, they still have to continue maintaining a lot of their legacy operations in China. And I think a lot of the types of investments that you're seeing are actually being deployed in China to do just that.
So are you, in that vein, right, are you advocating for complete withdrawal from China, or gradual, or is it more new investments not going to China?
I think it's not realistic to ask our companies to move everything overnight, because the reality is China has a lot of infrastructure that's very sticky and very hard to replicate elsewhere in a short amount of time. But I am strongly in favor of repealing permanent normal trade relations and having a tariff regime with Chinese entities and the People's Republic of China that creates a macroeconomic environment that provides companies with a strong incentive to go about the business of reshoring their supply chains elsewhere outside of China quickly. We need them to do this fast. Admiral John Aquilino said just a few weeks ago that China, by all conventional metrics, is on track to having and building the capabilities the military capabilities it needs in order to invade Taiwan by 2027. So we could be on the precipice of a major type of confrontation in the Asia Pacific that we shouldn't falsely signal to our companies that we're living in business as usual times. These are not times where business should be conducted as usual. They need to reshore quickly if they want to be able to survive a potential geopolitical shock.
Yeah, I think most companies have come to this realization now. It's no longer business as usual. And in fact, because of the geopolitical situation, it seems like the defense industry is doing pretty well. And what we're seeing is that, Congressman Mike Gallagher, who's been very effective and just visited Taiwan, is stepping down from the chairmanship of the House Select Committee on China. And is resigning early from his congressional seat to join Palantir, where you're also a senior advisor. Can you share with us, why is this hurry?
Well, Mike's plans for what he decides to do after his tenure in the House are still only rumors and ultimately up for him and his family to decide.
Okay. And do you think that the defense industry is benefiting from the current geopolitical tensions, not just Taiwan Strait, but Ukraine, Russia, and the Middle East, and elsewhere? Is this is a good business right now?
I mean, so I guess if your question is about Palantir, actually most of the growth is coming from the private sector, Palantir's private business. Palantir is a company that does a lot of business in the public sector and the private sector.
Mhm.
Its private sector business has grown incredibly rapidly. That's been a huge area of growth for Palantir specifically. Now, when it comes to legacy contractors, there's no question that, look, if we need more planes, if we need more ships, that's probably going to be good for legacy contractors. But I will say, if you look at the overall, the overall amount of money that we spend in defense in the US, and then if you just look at outputs, how many ships do we have? How many planes do we have? How many missiles do we have? Compared to the amount of money that our most political rivals abroad, like China, spend on defense and the capabilities they get for every dollar. They have a lot more ships. They have a lot more of almost everything. And so, when you ask whether it's good for business, I think it's important to say that it's really, really that in a lot of ways, as a country, we have suffered enormously from the atrophying of our defense industrial base. So I think it's really important that we think through how do we deploy capital in the defense ecosystem in a way that actually helps rejuvenate that industrial base so that we can actually get a lot more output for every dollar that is an input into a defense expenditure. I think that is really one of the central questions of our time.
Yeah, and probably with the new technologies, AI and quantum computing, where a lot of it touches on sort of national competency kind of technologies. The U.S. certainly needs to think more about how to concentrate and align private expertise as well as government priorities. On that, what are the other key China-related issues you're hoping to accomplish over the remainder of this term of Congress and even into the Trump administration, which may be a wild card?
Well, I'm very, very supportive of ultimately having a holistic recalibration of our tech trade agenda with China holistically.
Mhm.
I think we're way past due a holistic recalibration of our overall trade agenda with China.
What should that
Ultimately,
look like? When you say that, what should that look like? It does feel like our current government in the US right now, it's pretty spread out and not sure if there's a very centrally coordinated approach.
that means being brutally honest about the fact that the Chinese are not our friends. They're decoupling from us. And when I say the Chinese, I mean the Chinese Communist Party are not our friends. They're decoupling from us incredibly quickly. They're building out their military. And we need to be honest about the fact that on the software side, we need strong restrictions on Chinese software in the US that can be imposed quickly. And on the hardware side, we need a tariff regime that creates a strong incentive to move our hardware supply chains outside of China to get those supply chains outside of the reach of China's jurisdictional and political control. We need to do that very, very quickly. And then on the capital flow side, we do need to have new restrictions on cross-border US-China capital flows. We can't have, a situation where you still have an enormous number of Chinese venture capital firms that are still investing in some of our most sensitive AI technologies in the US. That shouldn't be happening. And likewise, it doesn't make sense at this point to have American pension fund money and retirement accounts being deployed in the People's Republic of China, where private property is, nothing but a vague illusion. So I think we really need to have a holistic recalibration of our entire trading relationship with China. And I think, the easiest place to start are tariffs, software restrictions, and capital flow restrictions.
Well, thank you. I think you have been one of the people that truly are pushing and thinking hard about how to address China as a threat holistically, especially from the technology sector. And I'm glad that today you get to talk to our audience in a more in a lengthier way, more than just a few sound bites. So thank you, Jacob, so much, and we'll be paying attention to what's to come in the legislative agenda. But thank you.
It was great seeing you.